My name is Eric Proctor, and I'm the Wildlife Education Coordinator for the Arizona Game and Fish Department. And you are here to listen to the educator webinar focused on what we're calling America's Wildlife. The America's Wildlife curriculum is a set of 5 lessons that were originally written for high school social studies or science classrooms. In addition, those lessons became so popular that some informal groups such as zoos and other organizations like that wanted something similar that they could operate in a non-classroom based format. So we actually created 3 additional activities for informal classrooms. These were pilot tested across Arizona. We had over 500 students. We had most counties represented. Teachers were covered in rural areas, in urban areas, suburban areas, to sort of get an idea of how this flowed out here. The original vision, what we wanted to see in this curriculum, was developed by the department, the Arizona Game and Fish Department, by which we work. And obviously, if you're not familiar, because I didn't do this at the beginning, but the Arizona Game and Fish Department is the state wildlife agency. So we are responsible for managing Arizona's wildlife resources. So most people interact with us through hunting and fishing, and that's a big part of what we do, but it's not everything that we do. And we'll explain that a little bit in the role that hunting and angling has in wildlife management. So we sort of developed this vision of what was the message, what did we want to tell people about wildlife conservation in North America. And then we also solicited input from other wildlife agencies as well as nonprofit groups across the nation. So organizations like Audubon, Sierra Club, other groups like that had an opportunity to provide some input into what should go into this curriculum. Obviously, like all of the stuff that we develop, it was aligned. In this case, it was actually aligned to national standards. This is a curriculum that once we developed it, it went national. And you'll see where we've been able to place that so far. So we did align it to national standards, but we do have an Arizona version, and the access that I'm going to give you, with the exception of perhaps Lawrence, who's listening from Albuquerque, I'll probably give you the national one, but we do have an Arizona version. And basically right now, the difference between the Arizona version and the national version is the Arizona version will tell you which Arizona standards it aligns to. But we align them in science, social studies, and then also in environmental education. And the goal of this curriculum basically is to introduce something that we call the North American model of wildlife conservation. Now, that brings us to an interesting point then. What is the North American model of wildlife conservation? I'm going to go ahead and put a poll up to see how many of you understand or are familiar with the North American model. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this. You should see it on your screen. You have some choices. You can go ahead and select the box that best describes your familiarity with the North American model. And so you have an option to say that basically you have no experience with it. You've heard of it, but you don't know much about it, or that basically you're an expert and you know everything about it. And while that poll is up there, I'm just going to go ahead and briefly explain. I'm not going to talk about the North American model yet because that's going to be in this next part of the conversation. But I do want to say that the North American model of wildlife conservation is a very, very important piece of what we do at the Arizona Game and Fish and across the nation with regards to how we manage wildlife. The problem is that very few people outside of wildlife management have ever heard of it. And you can actually see that with the poll that I'm going to go ahead and close here. And I'm going to share this poll with you so you can see what it looks like. You can see the results, and you can see that most of you, very few of you, are actually familiar with it. In fact, nobody responded that they were familiar with it. Most of you said you've heard of it, but you really couldn't tell anything about it. And then a few of you have no idea what it even is. And that's the problem that we're facing in game and fish agencies across the nation. Is here we have this very, very important idea of wildlife management in the country, and the students, the people that we are trying to recruit to become the wildlife managers of the future, don't know what it is. And so we wanted something that could start telling people about this. What I really like about the story of the North American model of wildlife conservation, you're going to hear that in just a second here, is that it is also sort of a story of the history of our country and the democratic process in our country. they're closely tied together. So as we see that the country grew and expanded across from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, we saw certain principles that were guiding those beliefs, and those are some of the same principles that we see that guide wildlife conservation. So it fits really, really nicely in history classes. In fact, I think it actually fits better in American history classes than it does in science classes, but it's also a really good opportunity for you science teachers or you social studies teachers to learn to work together. This gives you tools to start that conversation, and you could be teaching some stuff in social studies and some stuff in science, which I think really fits well. So with that said, I want to go ahead and tell you a little bit about the history. So this is going to be a part that I'm going to kind of talk at you for a little bit, and I apologize for that. But everything that you're going to see here, this is a modified version of a PowerPoint that's going to be made available to you as part of the curriculum that you're going to receive. So you will have access to all of this stuff, but I've modified it a little bit to shorten it for our purposes a little bit, because today you're not necessarily acting as students in this. You're just going to be hearing the story a little bit. So I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can, but it can be somewhat lengthy. This is going to be a big bulk of the presentation, but it's going to give you a really good background about the North American model and how it was developed. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. As Americans in the 21st century, we are fortunate to live in a nation of natural beauty and abundance. We live in a country where we can readily visit national parks, reserves, and wilderness and see astounding natural scenery and wildlife. Our country is famous for the majestic elk, the grizzly, the bison, and the wolf. But not so long ago, in fact, just 100 years ago, the fate of our wildlife was in its most precarious state. Many species were on the brink of extinction, and if the status quo of that time continued, today there would be no bison, grizzly, wolf, elk. None at all. We would have hunted them to extinction. The story, and so you're going to see that we did some stuff to help this. Obviously, we didn't get that. We have bison still today. We have wolf. We have elk. All those things are alive. They may not be, some of them may not be as plentiful as they used to. Some may actually be more than they were. But that's the story we're gonna sort of teach over the next 30 minutes or so, 20 to 30 minutes, which obviously tells us about the North American model. So the story begins with the founding of our country. When colonists first settled here, they encountered an abundance of natural resources. Settlers quickly learned which trees made the best lumber, which fields made the best farmlands, and which wildlife was the best game. For many early settlers, unregulated hunting was a privilege they had never experienced. Back in Elizabethan England, game belonged to the landowners, who were usually royalty, and only the wealthy participated in big game hunting. Commoners were reduced to taking small game from the minimally available public lands. So in England, where they had come from, where the settlers had come from in the United States, they really didn't have access to hunting unless they were wealthy, unless they belonged to the royal class. They had very limited access to hunting. And so they actually began to resent wildlife in many cases. And so when they came to this country, they wanted something different. They wanted the wildlife to be available to everyone. And so that became a very important keystone of what we're going to be talking about here in a little bit. Hunting wildlife was an important part of the settling of this land. Wild game was crucial to the survival of the early settlers, and deer, turkey, moose, elk, and small game were an important part of the early American diet. Wildlife was also valued for its fur and feathers. Many Europeans saw the natural bounty of the American wilderness as a source of wealth, with the fur-bearing animals such as beaver being abundant, free for the taking, and whose hides were profitable to sell. At the time, the bounty seemed endless. Beaver pelts were considered not only a measure of wealth and currency, but the most important natural resource to come out of the New World. Demand for furs in Europe grew, and more trappers came to the New World to partake in the bounty. By the 1700s, beaver became increasingly scarce in eastern North America. Trappers moved west, exploring the wilderness and extracting an abundance of pelts from the western lands. With a strong belief in manifest destiny, or America's right and duty to expand across the continent, the settlers pressed westward. More and more land was cleared for settlements and agricultural fields. Forests were cut for fuel, wood, and lumber. This westward expansion increased the demand for game. By the 1800s, however, animals such as deer, bison, pronghorn, elk, and beaver were becoming scarce in some places, primarily due to unregulated hunting and loss of habitat. The first transcontinental railroad, completed in 1869, not only brought new settlers, but provided easier access to western hunting grounds. The railroad also made the shipping of animal hides to the east more convenient and economical for market hunters. Market hunting, which is the shooting or capture of wildlife for sale to milliners, restaurants, or other markets, became big business during the mid to late 1800s. Not only were market hunters taking fur-bearing animals, but market hunting for birds also became popular and profitable for food, down, and fashion. The other thing I wanted to point out as we go through here is all these pictures are real pictures. Most of them came from the Library of Congress or related sources, so this is a great example of primary source documents. Some of these pictures just even bewilder me as I still watch them, and I've seen this presentation a number of times. You'll be shocked, I think, by some of the pictures that you see here in just a little bit. The story of the demise of the American bison is well known to most Americans. Professional market hunters, responding largely to the demand for buffalo hides and meat, hunted the bison to near extinction in the late 19th century. Aided by the development of more efficient guns and the transportation opportunities provided by the railroad, unregulated hunting reduced the American bison herd from a population of at least 30 million to a few thousand. By the late 1800s, the American bison was on the brink of extinction. And so you can see this. This is a picture of 40,000 buffalo hides that are getting ready to be transported onto the trains back to the East Coast. Okay, just very, very common. These were very, very common sights that we would see during this westward expansion. By 1889, the total number of bison running wild and unprotected was 635. Added to that were 256 captive bison and 200 that were under government protection in Yellowstone National Park. So we went from an estimated 30 million bison in the plains to maybe 1,000 in a very, very short amount of time. Bison were so scarce that hunting actually became unprofitable. While most people know the story of bison, few know that during that same era, other wildlife populations such as deer, elk, pronghorn, cougar, wolf, grizzly, turkey, and waterfowl were drastically declining as well. Habitat loss, market hunting, and predator eradication efforts all contributed to the decline. In the eastern waterways and wetlands, waterfowl were being decimated by market hunters, with some species very near extinction. Now I want you to take a look at the picture in the left-hand corner there. That is not, this was obviously prior to Photoshop. That is a real picture. That is not made up in any way. Those are real guns. In an attempt to kill as many birds as possible in the shortest amount of time and with the least effort, market hunters employed a variety of techniques and weapons. To aid in the slaughter, gun technology advanced to ensure more take with fewer shots. The punt gun, which you see on the left, was a modified shotgun used by market hunters to kill waterfowl. It was mounted on a small boat and could shoot up to 100 birds in a single shot. Pretty amazing. Waterfowl are migratory birds, and many species come from various breeding grounds in the north to only a few bays along the eastern seaboard to overwinter. These bays and marshes would harbor thousands and thousands of wild ducks, geese, and other waterfowl. These wintering grounds became a shooting ground for market hunters. Basically became a bottleneck where all these migratory birds had to flock through a few specific waterways, and the hunters would just hang out in those waterways. And then they would use weapons like the punt gun and just take them out by the thousands at a time. In any market-driven situation, one cannot place all the blame on the supplier. Those in demand of the game meat were equally at fault. Game meat, furs, and especially ornamental bird feathers were all in great demand and were very fashionable at the time. So while it's easy to blame the market hunters, we have to understand that they made a profit because people wanted what they provided. When William T. Hornaday, director of the New York Zoological Society, published his seminal book, Our Vanishing Wildlife, in 1913, some wildlife species had already been exploited to extinction or near extinction due to unregulated hunting. North American birds that were already or nearly extinct included the great auk, the Carolina parakeet, and the passenger pigeon. In addition to the loss of birds, several species of large mammals were in danger. Numbers of elk, deer, pronghorn, grizzly, and wolves were drastically declining. In fact, an entire subspecies of elk, which occurred in the Southwest, called Merriam's elk, was eradicated before it could even be scientifically described. The last Merriam's elk was killed in Arizona around 1900. So actually the only, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, the only native species of elk that we have went extinct in the 1900s. And we had to replace those with Rocky Mountain elk that we brought in later to fill the niche that they did in the ecosystem. As wildlife numbers dwindled in the late 1800s, it was clear that something needed to be done. The exploitation of wildlife had to stop. To ensure America would have any wildlife in the next century, wildlife would have to be conserved and wildlife populations brought back from the brink of extinction. It was time to turn the tides and save our vanishing wildlife. But who would do it? And this actually, it appears that I've lost my script for the rest of this, so I'm just going to wing it a little bit. So what we started to find is that sportsmen, those that were hunting these animals for sport, a lot of people don't like that term, but those that were hunting the wildlife for sport as opposed to the market hunters, to differentiate themselves from the market hunters, were the ones that started to step forward, and they started to realize that they won't have a hobby if the market hunting was to continue. So they started to step forward, and the sportsmen hunters were some of the first ones to come forward and say something needs to be done. Everybody's familiar with Teddy Roosevelt for the most part. He was not yet president, but he would go on to found the Boone and Crockett Club, and the Boone and Crockett Club became one of the biggest proponents. It was a hunting club, and it became one of the biggest proponents of what we call fair chase. Does anybody go ahead and in your questions box, tell me what you think we mean by the term fair chase. When we're talking about fair chase with regards to hunting, what do we mean? I'll give you a few seconds to sort of type up an answer on what you think the term fair chase means. Okay, we have Lawrence has said that they're not confined in the natural habitat. Christine, they're not protected. Tiffany, the animal has the ability to elude the hunter. Giving the animals a fair chance, no hunting when they're penned in, no using weapons like the punt gun. That's what Nicole indicates. Kim adds hunting animals in the wild without trapping, and then giving the animals a chance, finding them roaming free in the wild is what Todd says as well. So good. In general, you guys are bouncing around this term of fair chase, and depending on who you ask and which organizations you ask, they might have different definitions, and the line for what they consider to be fair and unfair is going to be a little bit different depending on the hunter that you speak to. But in general, the concept is giving the animals a fair chance to escape, and you can see that in this cartoon here. This is a very, very famous political cartoon where somebody, and actually where Teddy Roosevelt got his name Teddy, or where the teddy bear came from, was this idea of somebody wanted to basically tie up this bear and give Teddy Roosevelt a chance to hunt him, and he refused. He didn't feel that that was part of the sport, that the animal should have a chance to get away. And in fact, in most hunting, the animal is more likely to get away than not get away. And that's often what we consider fair chase. Again, what firearms you use are often debatable as far as what people consider fair and unfair. So for some people, they feel that it's just a bow and arrow, that you have to get back to those types of things. Other people don't go quite as far as that, but it just kind of depends. So the edges of fair chase are probably up for debate, but in general, it means giving the animal a fair chance to escape. And Boone and Crockett Club, a hunting organization that was started by Teddy Roosevelt before he became president, was the leading proponent of this idea of fair chase. And then if we step back all the way to the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta was a British document that was basically controlling the power of the king. It was putting some sidebars and some controls on the power of the king. It wasn't an American document, But what's interesting is it was a founding document for our Constitution. It was something that was cited by the Founding Fathers when they created the Constitution. It has been upheld in court by the Supreme Court as basically a piece of the Constitution. It's not technically a part of the Constitution, but there have been Supreme Court decisions that have been made based on what the Magna Carta says because it was a foundational document for the writing of our own Constitution. And this is the concept. What's outlined in the Magna Carta is this concept of public trust. And the public trust idea actually goes all the way back to Roman emperors in 530 AD. And you can see his quote there, "By the law of nature, these things are common to all mankind, the air, running water, the sea, and consequently the shores of the sea." The idea of public trust, or what we call the public trust doctrine, is this idea that there are certain things that people can't own, that they belong to everyone. And in the United States, because that idea of public trust was outlined in the Magna Carta, although it's not explicitly stated in the Constitution, it has been upheld, this idea of public trust, that there are resources that do not belong to any one individual in this country. Those are things like air, water, forests, wildlife. That's this idea of public trust. Now, what we do then is, since they don't belong to any one individual, we entrust those resources to the government to be managed for all people, today and into the future. That's this idea of public trust, is that we take certain resources, we entrust them into the hands of government to be managed for everyone, that you as an individual can't own those specific resources. And it's a very, very important. In fact, I think this is probably one of the most important things when we talk about wildlife management. But again, it goes back to Roman Empire, and it was actually solidified in the Magna Carta. And we actually can see some of these pieces upheld by the Supreme Court. And this is a decision that came out in Geer versus Connecticut, which was in the early 1900s. And you can see that the part of the opinion of the court that was written by Justice White, who you see his picture there in the lower left-hand corner. While the fundamental principles upon which the common property and game rest have undergone no change, the development of free institutions had led to the recognition of the fact that the power of control lodged in the state is to be exercised as a trust for the benefit of the people and not for the benefit of private individuals as distinguished from the public good. So this was one of the first cases in which the public trust doctrine was challenged in court, and it was upheld by the Supreme Court. And since then, it's actually been upheld a number of times. So even though it's not explicitly stated in the Constitution, this idea of public trust as a specific job of the government has been upheld by the Supreme Court. This became one of the key features. Now we started to put in some pieces into place to start controlling market hunting. And you can see, again, some phenomenal pictures of some of these people that were doing some of this market hunting. Okay. The other thing that needed to happen is they needed public support. So you had magazines like Forest and Stream. Now, Forest and Stream is a hunting and angling magazine. It was started by hunters and anglers, and it was for hunters and anglers. And these magazines became the public voice for some of these decisions, some of these ideas that needed to be pushed out there. And you can see here, there's an article in a Forest and Stream where they actually talk about limit on hunting licenses, that there shouldn't be an unlimited number of hunting licenses out there, that there should be specific numbers that are taken because it needs to be controlled and managed. So it was the hunters through these magazines that started pushing for this idea of limits on hunting. We already talked about Boone and Crockett Club. Theodore Roosevelt was one of the founders. They became one of these key pieces in here, and other hunting-based organizations like that. Now, hunters weren't the only ones, and we're going to admit that as well. George Bird Grinnell, who became the founder of the Audubon Society, and then John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, and some of these other people like that were also making a push for some of those. Now, they didn't always agree on everything, but the idea of wildlife conservation and preserving the natural world had a voice from these guys, as well as the hunters and anglers. But everybody's sort of familiar with the role that some of these people had, and they're less familiar with the impact that the hunters and anglers had. Now, John Lacey was a representative out of Iowa, I believe. Looking through my notes here, if I have it on there. And he wrote a bill that eventually passed in 1900 that became the Lacey Act. And the Lacey Act was a key important because what it did was it banned the transport of dead animals that had been illegally across state lines that had been taken illegally in a state. I know it's a little confusing, but basically what this did was this banned market hunting. So if a state passed a law, what was often happening is a state was passing a law about wildlife, and then the people would kill that animal, and then they would just take them to another state where perhaps that law wasn't there, and then the state had a hard time proving it, and then it was out of the jurisdiction of the state. So this made it a federal crime to do that. If you poached an animal, if you illegally took an animal in one state and then moved that animal across state lines, you now became a federal crime. Okay? Now this was important because remember when we looked at those bison, they were killing them in the west, and then they were shipping them on the Transcontinental Railroad back to the east. They were doing the same with beaver pelts. They were sending them to the east where the market was because there weren't people in the west really that much. So all the market was on the east coast. So market hunters, in order to make their money, had to ship them across the country. And now if you did it illegally, if you purposely broke the laws in a state and then tried to ship those somewhere, you could now get nailed for a federal crime. And then Lacey had a famous quote there, "We have given an awful exhibition of slaughter and destruction, which may serve as a warning to all mankind. Let us now give an example of wise conservation of what remains the gifts of nature." Now, the Lacey Act is still in place, and in fact, a version of it, I think it's been modified a little bit, but a version of it was recently used in a poacher that had done some stuff in another country. And they were actually implementing the Lacey Act, which was kind of fascinating. But the Lacey Act was the first law now to basically saved egrets. It saved some of these other birds. It was now illegal to kill these birds in one state if the law was in place and then ship them so that they'd become hat adornments in another state. So very, very important law that came into place. Okay. The other thing was the advent of what hunters and anglers started to realize at the time too was it was one thing to have these laws in place, but you also needed certain areas where animals could just escape. They couldn't be hunted all the time. They needed places where they couldn't. They needed places of refuge. So this concept of national wildlife refuges started up as well at the same time, and then national parks as well started to be created to give wildlife an escape. Places in the U.S. where they couldn't be hunted. The other thing that needed to take place is we started to realize that migration was a key factor of what we're talking about. We needed to have laws in place because what we realized was if you have an animal that is crossing state boundaries, and animals don't recognize state lines, they don't even recognize country lines. They're migrating. In the case of birds are some of the biggest examples. Now you could pass a law in the winter habitat for that animal, but if similar things weren't taking place in the summer habitat of that animal, you weren't going to have a lot of luck protecting that animal. And so we started to realize then that we needed to start looking at migration and how we could work together across state lines and how we could work together across country lines. And so we eventually developed the Migratory Bird Act, which protected the parts and pieces of migratory birds and songbirds and some of those as well. So now it became a crime not only to kill the animal, but to even be in possession of some of those pieces of the animal. So you couldn't have the wing or you couldn't have the feathers, and this law is still in place as well. Now, these laws were great, and they were in place, but the problem was the states had no money to enforce them. They didn't have the ability to force them because they didn't have any money to do that. They didn't have law officers in the field that could do that. And so they started looking for other solutions. And that's where things like the licenses started to be developed. We created, states started requiring hunting licenses, and the money that was spent on those hunting licenses went to the enforcement of these laws. But before that could even happen, hunters were sort of encouraged to follow this code of conduct. The sportsman hunters were asked to follow this code of conduct. The other thing that was happening at the same time is a guy named Aldo Leopold. And if you're not familiar with Aldo Leopold, I highly suggest you get familiar with him. But he is basically considered the father of wildlife management. He was the guy who moved the field from basically being just a bunch of suppositions about how many animals were out there to using scientific protocols on how we can figure out populations and how we can manage effectively. He actually created the first textbook called game management, which was being used well into the 80s and 90s, and some schools probably still use his textbook. He was the first professor of wildlife management in the country over at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So he created the field of wildlife management from a scientific perspective. So this was all being done at the same time. We started to realize that there were laws that needed to be in place, but at the same time we also needed to know more about wildlife populations. We needed to have science to back what we were doing. The other thing that was happening as well is now that the public had to be involved. We recognized that wildlife is a public resource, so the public has to have a say. They own it as a group. Remember, no individual can own wildlife, but as a public, our government does, and so the people own the wildlife, so they have to be actively involved, and that's a key factor of what we're talking about here. So we already talked about licenses and states developing licenses so that they can start to fund these laws. The other thing that I want to talk about is two key laws that were passed in the 30s and 40s. The first one is called the Pittman-Robertson Act, named after a senator from Nevada and a representative from Virginia. And what this did was this placed an excise tax on hunting and shooting equipment. So when you bought firearms, or you went and bought ammunition, you were paying a tax. Now, you don't see that tax on your receipt because it's actually built into the manufacturer of the cost. So the manufacturers of the ammunition, the manufacturers of the firearms, they are paying this tax. Now, they're passing that tax most likely on to you in the cost of the firearm, in the cost of the materials. But that tax, that excise tax, comes back to the federal government and then is distributed back to the states for the purposes of wildlife conservation. This is what we're calling both the licenses and then this excise tax are what we call a user pay model. The people that are using the wildlife resource, the people that are hunting for it, the people that are fishing for it, they are the ones that are paying for it. Most state agencies, Game and Fish included, most state wildlife agencies do not take taxpayer dollars. There is nothing out of the general fund, some your sales tax, your income tax, none of that comes to the Game and Fish. We are funded on a user pay model. So when you buy a hunting license, that money is going directly back to wildlife conservation. When you go buy ammunition, when you go buy a firearms, those are coming directly back into Game and Fish's pockets to help us with wildlife management. Okay. That was done, so the Pittman-Robertson Act was done on firearms. A similar thing was done a few years later called the Dingell-Johnson Act, which was on fishing equipment. So this is how we paid for the aquatic wildlife. The Pittman-Robertson helped us with the terrestrial wildlife. The Dingell-Johnson helped us with the aquatic wildlife. It was later amended to include boating fuel and other things like that. So when you buy certain boating materials, you are also paying into the Dingell-Johnson Act. Now, these two bills are still in place. Now, what's fascinating about these two bills that these two laws that I want to talk about, and it was a brilliant piece of work that was done in there, is they put a few words into the bill that basically said, if at any time a state legislature tries to divert these funds for other uses, the state will lose all of their matching funds. So let's go back and understand how this bill works. So again, you pay this tax when you buy some of this equipment, and it goes to the federal government. The federal government gets a big bank of this excise tax, and they distribute it back to the states. Now, it's distributed back to the states based on a formula, and that formula has something to do with the license sales. So the more licenses that a state sells, the more of that tax dollar they get, the more of that excise tax money that they get. Now, that comes to them on a 3-to-1 matching fund. So for every dollar that the state contributes, the federal government contributes $3 back. So this law, when they passed it, they said if a state tries to divert license fees, so if the state legislature comes in and says, you know what, we don't think hunting licenses, the fees for those should be used for wildlife, we need them to pay for police officers, or we need them to pay for school funding, or we need them to pay for whatever it might be. If they divert it, they lose the matching funds that come in from this excise tax. So they actually lose more money that's coming into the state. So it was a very, very powerful piece. That piece is still in there as well. And that's something that we often still have to educate our legislators on is, look, you can't divert that money, because if you do, the hunters and anglers paid for that license knowing that that's what the money was going to be used for. So it's not fair for you to divert it. And if you do, the state loses additional money that comes in from the federal government. So it's a very, very powerful piece. Really, really kind of cool. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. And as I mentioned, the money that comes in from the license sales, that comes in from the Dingle Johnson, that comes in from the Pittman Robertson, is what we do for the hands-on wildlife management. It's what puts the animals back in the wild. It's what puts the habitats back in place. It pays for our education programs and a lot of those types of things. It pays for our research to study these animals. Very, very key piece. Now, each of these things that we've talked about in and of themselves are important, but they all work together over time, and they didn't pass at one time. They all sort of came together over 50, 60, 70 years of seeing problems occur and trying to address being solutions to specific problems. Those all together came to what we call the North American model of wildlife conservation and have brought these animals back from the brink of extinction. So just to clarify a little bit, there are 7 what we call tenets or guidelines of the North American model of wildlife conservation. We've talked about all of these. I illustrated where they came from, but these are the 7 guiding principles of the North American model. And they aren't listed in any particular order of which one's more important. Personally, I tend to think that the first one on there is the most important one, but other people would have other arguments as well. Wildlife is held in the public trust, this idea that you as an individual cannot own wildlife. And that was very different than what we saw in England, in Victorian England at the time. Remember, I said the royalty basically owned wildlife, and so the commoners began to resent the wildlife. Commerce in wildlife is regulated, so we basically banned market hunting. There are a few exceptions where you can actually sell wildlife, but that's greatly, greatly regulated. Hunting and fishing laws are created through a public process, so because you as the public own the wildlife, you need to be involved in it as a public process. It shouldn't be closed off to you. Everyone has the opportunity to hunt and fish. This does not mean that you have to hunt and fish, but the fact that you have the opportunity to hunt and fish means that you are more likely as an individual to appreciate the wildlife. It's a resource that's available to you. Again, this goes back to that idea of Victorian England, where the commoners really didn't have that ability, and so they began to resent the wildlife, and we saw them kill wildlife for the sake of just to kill it, just for the idea that if I can't have it, you can't have it. But if it's a resource that's available to you, you might appreciate it more. That's the theory that this is going on to. Hunters and anglers fund conservation. Again, by no means are they the sole funders of conservation, but they are the largest funders of wildlife conservation in this country based on the model that we have. Audubon Society, Sierra Club, those are all great organizations that do good work. Nature Conservancy is in there as well. They do good work, but the amount of money that they put on the ground for wildlife conservation is shadowed by what hunters and anglers contribute through license sales and through the excise taxes that we've talked about. Science is the basis for wildlife policy, so we need to be using data-driven decisions when we are making laws about wildlife. And then wildlife is an international resource. We need to recognize that they're going to migrate, that they don't recognize state and international boundaries, and that we need to work together. These are the guiding principles of the North American model of wildlife conservation. Now, I will tell you, and this is my personal take on the wildlife of this model, I view the North American model as a dynamic document. If it's not really a document, but as a dynamic model, meaning that as time progresses, it's going to change. And we see that. If you had asked, what is the North American model of wildlife conservation 100 years ago, you may only have 2 or 3 of these tenets on here. Some of these got added later on. And I believe that personally, this might change in the future. I think these 7 will stay on here, but we might see new additions as we solve new problems. For example, is this going to address climate change for us? Is this going to address the changing role of hunting in our society? As fewer and fewer people hunt as a percentage of the population, what does that mean for funding of wildlife? A smaller percentage of the population is funding the wildlife conservation activities. So how do we need to address how other people that aren't hunters and anglers are also funding that resource? All these types of things are things that we need to consider, and that actually becomes a key element of the curriculum here in a little bit that I'm going to show you. I want to end then this piece, and we'll go back to the curriculum, by a quote by John Lacey. And of course, he didn't exactly know what the North American model of wildlife conservation was at the time. That concept of the North American model was created probably 15, 20 years ago, looking back and saying, why have we been so successful in the United States? The United States has and Canada have been far more successful in protecting our wildlife and conserving our native fauna than any other country out there. Why have we had that success? And so we looked back, and that's where those guidelines sort of came back. We started pulling out the key reasons why we've seen that. And of course, John Lacey then in 1900 was sort of predicting that with his Lacey Act. By taking this course, we will set an example to other countries, and the good work of bird and game protection in America may serve as a model. And we see that today. So again, just another slide to illustrate what the primary concepts of the North American model are. We've talked about those, so I'm going to go ahead and go through. Now let's talk really quickly about the curriculum. We have about 10 minutes left. I just want to tell you a little bit about what you can expect in this curriculum that tells the story that you just saw. First of all, if you're not familiar with some of the game and fish curriculum that we've developed in the past, you should know that just about everything comes in it. Everything that you need to teach it successfully will come with it. So you can see an example of some of the of one of the lesson plans here. It's a standard lesson plan. You can see that it shows how long it'll take, the grade levels it covers. You can see the standards, and it gives you procedures. It gives you the materials that you need to teach it. If there's worksheets that are provided, we also provide the key so that you as a teacher will have all the tools necessary to complete it. You also see in the lower left-hand corner, that's an example of the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint that I just showed you is actually the first 2 lessons of the curriculum, and I showed you a modified version of it. It gets a little bit longer to divide it and make it a little bit easier for the kids to understand. You can deliver that a couple different ways. Through the curriculum we give you, that it's actually provided as a video, so you could just plop it into a DVD player and you can play it as a movie. I have a colleague of mine who narrated it and tells the story of the history of wildlife conservation. So you could do that. If you prefer that you want to teach it, we provide you with the notes so that you can go ahead and know what you're supposed to say on each of the slides. Now, if you want to modify it, you're certainly welcome to do that, but at least we provide that to you. We provide you basically, for lack of a better term, a script that you could follow if that's what you wanted to do. So all of the stuff was included in the curriculum. So I'm going to tell you very quickly I'm going to break down the 5 lessons, and they're really broken down into 3 parts. As I mentioned, lessons 1 and 2 are the PowerPoint that you just saw. They were originally going to be 1 lesson, but it became so long and too cumbersome to try to get kids to understand, because there are some pretty abstract concepts in there, that we broke it into 2 lessons. And the logical break for us was right there at when we saw the early 1900s, when we saw the extinction of a lot of the animals, like the passenger pigeon and that piece. So lesson 1 goes from the settling of this country basically up into the early 1900s, when all the species were starting to go extinct. And then lesson 2 picks up saying, all right, now that we see this problem of animals going extinct, what are we going to do about it? And picks up on the solutions that we've implemented. What I would ask you is, for the most part, these lessons, you don't have to go through all 5 lessons in this unit. If you just want to introduce the concept of the North American model, you can do that through lessons 1 and 2 and do nothing more. What I would ask you, though, is don't just end at lesson 1, because if you do, it's going to leave a pretty sorry idea of what the state of wildlife in the United States, and that's not the case. We're very different from that, but it does set the stage for how we got there. Okay, so if you aren't going to teach all 5 lessons, I would ask that you at least do 1 and 2, because that gives them the overview. And you can see, and basically it is the PowerPoint that I showed you, that there's some worksheets that the kids can fill out while they're going through. The way we've designed the PowerPoint as well, there's places you can stop and you can have classroom discussions, and so we have some discussion questions that you can have when you're going through there as well. So we've tried to make it as interactive, so it's not just you standing up in front and talking to people. So that leads us into lessons 3 and 4. Now, lessons 3 and 4 build on what they learned in 1 and 2, but go into a lot more detail. Okay, again, completely optional if you choose to do them. I actually think there's my favorite lesson is actually lesson 3, which is conservation in context. Lesson 3 deals with the events, and lesson 4 deals with the people that were important in wildlife conservation. And so in lesson 3, they actually create a timeline, and they see where conservation fits in the context of everything else that's going in the world. So they start to see, do they start to recognize patterns? Were there moments in time where conservation, there was a big push in conservation, and were there areas where maybe conservation wasn't a focus of our country politically? And then why? Perhaps there was a war going on, and all of our energy and efforts went to that as opposed to conservation. And so it allows them to see that it's not just this black and white issue of saying, well, we have this problem, and we need to have a solution that it fits in the world and everything that's going on in the world, and there's going to be prioritizations, and our society is going to make decisions based off of that. And so it's my favorite lesson in there. And then, as I mentioned, lesson 4 focuses on the people. So they get introduced to people like Aldo Leopold, Teddy Roosevelt, George Bird Grinnell, Rachel Carson, some of the key movers and shakers in wildlife conservation. And so they get to be introduced to those. They actually become that person, and they get interviewed and do some stuff like that. So that's lessons 3 and 4. And then lesson 5 is sort of building on all of this. We call it bringing it home. And this idea, as I mentioned before, about the North American model being a dynamic model that may change as we progress into the future. What they do now is they start looking at ideally their state that they're in. So you would have kids looking at Arizona if you teach in Arizona. If you teach in New Mexico, like Lawrence does, you would be using New Mexico. Or there's actually some other options. You could actually divide the class up. So maybe some students are looking at Arizona, some students are looking at Hawaii, some students are looking at California, some students are looking at New York. And what they're doing is they're looking at the challenges that face wildlife today. And so they look at a state wildlife action plan. Now, every single state in the country created these wildlife action plans, and it basically is a comprehensive document that shows how we're going to manage for all of the wildlife that are found within our borders. So they look at an executive summary of that document, and they start to pull out what are the major challenges that state has identified as challenges to conserving wildlife and protecting wildlife in Arizona or in Texas or in New Mexico or New York, whatever the state might be. And then they have to apply the North American model to it. They can say, where do the aspects of the North American model apply to these? How will they help us solve this problem? And where does the North American model fall short? Are there new guidelines, new solutions that we need to look at? So it's a really cool piece. And I think in a classroom, if you were to have students look at different states, you would start to realize, one, that there are different challenges. What we are facing in Arizona is very different challenges than what they're facing in New York. And so the solutions are going to be very different. And so it's an interesting piece, and I really, really like this lesson as well, and it's a nice one to sort of apply all the information that they're doing before. So those are the lessons that were developed a few years ago. What I wanted to do is tell you some success stories about. Now this data that I have here is relatively old. I haven't updated it in a while, but I would say that the curriculum has been downloaded well over 200 times now. We know of it being utilized in at least 44 of the 50 states. So when I talk about it being a national curriculum, it basically is. Now the cool thing about that is it was created locally right here. It's also provided annually. Safari Club International hosts this, what they call the American Wildlife Leadership School every year. They bring groups of teachers out throughout the summer to spend a week on the grounds and learn about wildlife, and they actually provide this curriculum to every teacher that goes through there. They also include it in their hands-on wildlife kits, which are boxes that you can basically check out, or I think you buy them from Safari Club International. They're very similar to the bone boxes that we provide here in Arizona, which you can check out from us. They have a kit that you can purchase that has all this wildlife stuff, and they've actually included the curriculum in there. And then a very similar program at the Welder Wildlife Foundation also contributes this, provides this curriculum. So it's being picked up, it's being utilized as a tool to start telling the story so that we can help recruit new wildlife biologists, new wildlife managers, and they understand where we were, where we are now, and where we're going into the future. So let me continue here. And so what does it mean for you? Okay, you are going to have access to all of the curriculum. You can download it from our website, and I will, in a follow-up email to this that'll come out tomorrow, I will show you where you can have access to that. We have the videos of the PowerPoints that can be streamed from our YouTube page. You can also download them from the same website that I'm going to show you as well. Obviously, what's the saying? Teachers make the greatest thieves. You guys don't have to do, just like any lesson plan that you might get, we're not expecting that you're going to teach it word for word as we put it in there. Modify it as you see necessary. Incorporate it into your classrooms. We've had teachers that have done a science night or a family science night or a curriculum night at their school, and what they've done is they've had the video playing on a kiosk or something so that parents can learn about it as well. So those types of things are really kind of cool, and this is all available to you. With that, I think we are going to go ahead and wrap up. So again, you will get everything in a follow-up email. I will send you your certificate for those of you that were here for the hours that you were here for. Guys, thank you for taking some time during your busy schedule to come on out.